Well, thank you very much. It's tremendous to be part of the UNAA celebration, I would call it that, because this is a family of UN, and to be a UN official of more than 20 years, it's tremendous to see the vitality of youth and experience in the same room, trying to address some of the enormous challenges that are faced by the United Nations and the people that we work for around the world. Let me say, having spent 6 years the privilege of serving the High Commissioner for Refugees in this country, it's been a wonderful opportunity to see a vibrant civil society debating some of the most challenging issues, frankly, facing us internationally, the situation of humanitarian response to refugees and people who are displaced from their homes. So I do appreciate very much that this is an election period, and I will try to be as restrained, or more restrained than I normally am on these issues, and I think the arrangements for the session are a reasonably public discussion in presentation, but when it comes to questions and answers, the cameras and recording goes off, and we can have a very frank discussion about some issues that might be of interest to you. The theme of protecting human rights through UN processes, I would like to perhaps twist slightly and talk about the protection of human rights, or if you like, the protection of refugees of particular concern to us, through solidarity and through presence. Not just the United Nations, but those for whom we and with whom we work. The images of human displacement, I think, have never been more graphic than what we're seeing in Syria today. Across the screens, across the news reports, the enormous displacement and tragedy and suffering that are visited upon the peoples of that country today, I think we haven't seen since the exodus of following the genocide in Rwanda in 1994. Last year we published some statistics which make very sober reading. We estimate that globally some 45 million people, probably more, have been forcibly displaced from their homes. Interestingly in that, about 10 to 12 million people have had the benefit, and I put that word advisedly, of crossing over an international border to activate the international protection system of asylum and the international protection system of refugee protection, which is a broadly agreed international system with a set of rules and responsibilities on states. For the more than 25 million people who remain displaced within their homes and within their own countries, the situation, of course, is far more grim because of the lack of access and the lack of effective international support and protection. What occurs to us, of course, is that behind each and every one of these statistics is a human story, a human narrative. It's very easy to become glazed by the enormity of the tragedy, but each and every one of those 45 million people has a narrative of survival, resilience, and hope and aspiration for themselves and their families. So I think in the debate in Australia around numbers and relativity of the problem nationally and the problem globally and regionally, it's extremely important to remember that behind each and every one of those numbers is a human story just like ours. The other interesting fact, which is not sufficiently understood, I think, particularly in this region, is that of the millions of people being looked after globally, 80% of those are in the developing world, in countries that can least afford to look after their own peoples with social service and support and providing opportunities to their own populations. And yet, willingly and unquestioningly, they put out the hand of friendship to support and protect hundreds, if not millions, of people who come from somewhere else. If you've seen where the true burden of international protection of refugees lies, it's in those great camps of Kakuma and Dadaab, cities of 500,000 or more people, where people have not lived for days or weeks or months, but even decades. Intergenerationally, people live the experience of refugees because there is no political solution and safety and security through which they can go home and pick up their lives. For UNHCR, probably one of the most operational of the UN agencies, we are truly out there doing what we talk. UNHCR has some 7,000 plus employees, and about 90% of those are in the field. And some of those people have left their families and their loved ones far behind, including many Australians, and are working in some of the most complex and some of the most dangerous places on the planet today. So we know from first-hand experience what the situation is and the tragedy that is being visited on so many thousands of people and millions of people globally. Our High Commissioner estimates that we haven't, in recent history, had so many humanitarian challenges simultaneously and consecutively. The huge demands on the humanitarian community are being stretched to their capacity. There is not enough funding for the programs needed to provide even the most basic of life-sustaining support for people in these very difficult and challenging circumstances. The list goes on. We have heard already, I think, from Ian and Mike yesterday, the work that they've been doing on behalf of the United Nations in some of these challenging places, the work in Mali, the efforts in Sudan, South Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Syria, Afghanistan, and of course the unresolved or forgotten crises that bubble away, that still continue to visit terrible trouble and problems for people who have not had their situations resolved. In Syria alone, we estimate that there are about 1.6 million people who are forced from their homes and are living across in the genuine help and solidarity of countries contiguous to Syria. We estimate that unless a peace plan is put in place and that conflict is stopped by the end of the year, we could see as many as 3.5 million people displaced across those borders as refugees. We could see half of the population of Syria forcibly displaced from within its own borders. That's a population of 22 million. So roughly the same population as Australia, half of that population being forcibly displaced from their homes by the end of the year unless something is done in terms of a peace plan and a resolution of this terrible conflict. We also are starting to see the implications of an unresolved conflict in Syria across the border in Lebanon, which is seeping into the cracks of sectarianism and threatening to destabilize other countries, which to date are doing a tremendous amount in terms of solidarity for their near neighbors. So the major challenges for us as an organization internationally, and I'll come back to this theme of solidarity and burden sharing in the Australian context shortly, because I think the relativity of the debate in Australia against what's happening internationally is extremely important and often misunderstood and misrepresented. The first major challenge for UNHCR and others with whom we work very closely in the international community is clearly one of resources. If you look at the ratio between UNHCR protection officers and the people for whom we're responsible in the field, it's a staggering one. And it's impossible to deliver effective protection across the suite of measures that people can expect through health, sanitation, gender-based violence, human insecurity in these very difficult, lawless and fragile places. The other area of enormous challenge to us is one of coordination. In complex emergencies and crises such as Syria, we're dealing with many different forms of displacement. We're dealing with former refugees from Iraq who've gone across to Syria. We're dealing with internally displaced people. We're dealing with new refugees coming from Syria across the borders into Turkey and Lebanon and to Jordan and other countries which are hosting large numbers. So there is no one cap fits all. There are various different forms of displacement. And within the UN system, we've done our best, and Ian knows this very well, we've done our best to be more effective. Donors have asked us to be more effective. We've done that through a variety of ways, through the One UN approach, through more effective clusterized responsibilities across different agencies. But I think it's fair to say that in the very complex environments within which we work today, we've got a long way to go in terms of being more effective, more coordinated, and delivering better protection outcomes and better human rights outcomes for the people that the United Nations is responsible. The third and critical area, which of course is linked to the other two, is the problem of access. It is easier traditionally to have access to refugee populations precisely because they've in some ways been removed from the intensity and the virus of the conflict itself. And although there are always challenges of getting effective protection to refugees, it's an awful lot easier than it is when one tries to bring support, life-giving support and protection in its various shapes and forms to people who are still caught up in conflict itself. The life of humanitarians has never been more dangerous than it is today. Civilians are inextricably caught up in the logic and the strategies of conflict, as are those who try to bring help. So humanitarians, regrettably, UNHCR, the Red Cross movement, NGOs, and an awful lot of people who are just simply doing their best to try to help are caught up, hijacked, kidnapped, and sometimes killed in the efforts to try to help people in these very complex environments. And of course, one of the reactions from the international community when faced with severe security issues and access issues is to recoil. One of the saddest legacies of the loss of the great Sergio Vera de Mello was the UN actually went into its shell for some time in terms of security. I remember being in Darfur in 2004, not long after I'd finished up a mission in the former Yugoslavia, and the UN simply wasn't present in West Darfur. The faith-based NGOs and others were out and about using their best intelligence to see what was safe and what was not safe, fluid environments. But the UN was bunkered down in our various capitals of the different states of Sudan. We weren't out there being effective because we were risk-averse around security. And a lot of work has been done in that area to make sure that UN, particularly the humanitarian actors, are able to get out more flexibly. But it's still fair to say in places like Afghanistan that UN and UNHCR is not able to go to many of these places. And the great paradox in much of this is that national staff, national officers are out there doing much more effective protection work than many internationals because of the rules and regulations around movement and circulation. The other area, of course, of great concern is the fact that civilians are not only caught up in conflict, but given the asymmetric nature of warfare today and conflict today, civilians become the direct targets of the conflict itself. The mass displacements of peoples in West Darfur, South Darfur, where I was, and Democratic Republic of Congo, the violence and mass rapes, killings of women and children are not collateral damage, if you like, to conflict. They are the direct strategies and tactics of those people who are trying to bring about power for themselves and disempowerment of others. And these, to bring safe, effective protection to people in these lawless environments is enormously challenging without a strong political and financial support of the international community. So for us as an organization, as I said in my introductory remarks, the need for solidarity and international support and burden sharing has never been greater than it is today. And in that context, I'd like to make a few remarks about where I see Australia, having been here and observed the situation for 6.5 years. If you permit me a few more personal reflections of, I think, some of the positive and some of the more negative aspects of Australia's engagement on the question of solidarity and international burden sharing. On the more positive aspects, of course, Australia has been a wonderful leader in the United Nations, in these international peace initiatives that we're trying to bring to other parts of the world. Australia's funding to UNHCR in particular has been generous. This year is the most generous year of financial contributions to our programs of ever before. I think something in the order of $53 million. I'm not sure whether it's US or Australian. It's a little different these days. Australian dollars last year would have been a little bit more helpful to us than US dollars. It's been reversed. And about $14 million from civil society. That is ordinary Australians putting their hands in their pockets at $25 to $50 a week or a month and providing more than $14 million to life-saving activities for us internationally. That is an extremely credible and creditable contribution to the work that we do, because most of it is what we call unearmarked funding, which gives us greater discretion as to where we spend it. And I can assure you, those of you who do, through taxpayers' funding or through these various contributions to our national association, we're pretty efficient with that. We've got a very stripped-down bureaucracy in Geneva and a very active field presence, which we hope delivers, as best we can, effective protection outcomes for the people that were responsible. Australia last year also signed a 4-year partnership framework agreement with us for $105 million over 4 years, looking forwards, and we're very grateful for that because it's a core contribution with huge flexibility as to how we use it. As I said, Australia's contribution at the diplomatic and political level globally and regionally has enormous importance, both historically and present. And I know there's going to be an interesting discussion about how Australia can perhaps best use its privilege of being on the Security Council later on this afternoon. More closer to home on the issue of refugees, Australia has always had a generous resettlement program. Last year, following the expert panel conclusions, Australia doubled its core refugee resettlement contributions from some 6,000 people to 12,000 places per year. Well, certainly for the 2012 and 2013 year, that was fully subscribed. We're a bit disappointed that indications from 2012 and 13 is that will come back down towards 10,000 or less for other reasons. but it is a very credible and, as I said, creditable resettlement program that is helping take people from some of these terribly dangerous places and bring them to a place of safety and future in this tremendous country of Australia. The cooperation between civil society, government departments, NGOs at the state and federal level around resettlement and settlement is actually a world-setting model. It's tremendously well done. There's tremendous solidarity and cooperation between political parties of many persuasions and people with many different orientations to bring the best settlement outcomes as possible for people who come in that way to Australia. But the challenge that we believe for the global north and the industrialised world, and I include Australia in that, is how to show greater solidarity and burden sharing in relation to asylum. All of the 10 to 15 million people who have got protection, various degrees of quality, in the developing world are activating and using the system of asylum. And at the heart of the system of asylum is the 1951 Refugee Convention. And we know that the 1951 Convention, although it's more than 60 years old, can be supplemented and expanded and improved. It is still probably the most effective human rights instrument that has ever been in terms of delivering protection outcomes for a particular group of people. And it's effective because it's had 148 states that subscribe to it. The principle of non-refoulement or non-forced expulsion to face persecution and grave human rights violations is now embedded in customary international law, and it provides a statement and a cornerstone of international solidarity around which funding and mobilization of various forms of support can gravitate. So we are gravely concerned about discussions in this country about the integrity of the Refugee Convention itself. We're assured and reassured by the current government that the 1951 Convention is not to be renegotiated, and I dare say that if one tries to renegotiate any of these older instruments today, you would get a far less quality protection instrument than the ones that were forged very carefully in the ashes of the Second World War. In the region, we do face very significant challenges on how to deal with refugees. Australia is not the only country that deals with or receives refugees in this region. It's not well known, but Malaysia, which for those of you who are interested to know is my next posting as of the end of this year, has willingly housed more than 100,000 refugees, principally those from Burma, Chin, Karen, and increasingly Rohingya Burmese are coming into that country. Thailand is well known as hosting more than 100,000 people up on the Thai-Burmese borders for decades, and also a very large urban refugee population. These are countries that haven't signed the Refugee Convention and have been, I think, quite unfairly criticised sometimes, particularly around the discussions on the Malaysian deal about 18 months ago, but have really still provided, in a rather ambiguous environment, pretty reasonable levels of protection for large numbers of people. We understand that this accommodation between border management and security and humanitarian protection of refugees is a very complex and challenging one. But we're absolutely convinced that the way to deal with this is through a twin strategy of strong asylum procedures in a country, buttressed by engagement with like-minded countries in a sensitive and genuine way to try to resolve common problems through cooperation and collaboration. That for us is the key, and if one talks about genuine engagement in regional cooperation, it's not helpful in our view for the opening cards to be talking about Malaysia's solution, Indonesia's solution, East Timor solution, Pacific solution, round one and round two. Solution, of course, is a solution to one particular party, but is not a solution to the others. And I think language of engagement in the region is extremely important if we want to build carefully and discreetly and sensitively the sort of building blocks to help deal with these very complex, multi-dimensional issues. The use of language and the engagement is extremely important to us. We are concerned, as I say, in the current context, that the arrangements towards the Pacific do not have the attributes of burden sharing. These are, as we see it, burden shifting arrangements or burden deflecting arrangements away from countries that have a like-minded interest in managing irregular flows to two countries in particular that with the best will in the world are not able to offer the appropriate levels of protection required under the Refugee Convention. We are worried about that sort of thing as a global practice. If a country essentially declares that it is not prepared to offer asylum to a group of people who come in a particular way to that territory and deflects that responsibility to another place where the qualities of that protection are not available, then that does have very serious ramifications for us for the international protection system of asylum. It also sends very serious questions and signals out at a time when we're looking for greater solidarity and burden sharing, that the institution of asylum is the same set of rules and responsibilities on all states, wherever they may be geographically situated. We don't think that some of those responses address the root causes of human displacement. They might resolve the shorter-term objectives of stopping people going to a particular place, but it doesn't make people any less refugees, and it certainly doesn't make them any less in need of international protection. It just means that we, as UNHCR and other countries who are hosting these people, have to find protection outcomes and opportunities wherever they can. So I think these issues need to be very, very carefully worked at through this region. So if I might just indulge for another 90 seconds, where would we like to see the issue develop and evolve in this country and internationally? First of all, a restatement of the fundamental protection principles of the Refugee Convention. That's not just the right thing to do in moral and ethical terms, but it's the sensible thing to do. We believe that if you can, through the adherence to fundamental protection principles, find more effective safeguards and ways for people to be protected in other places, then they don't need to use difficult, dangerous and highly exploitative boat journeys such as people coming to Australia by vessel to come this way. They can find protection of a quality level in somewhere else. So human rights and human rights benchmarks and standards are very important ways of trying to engage regional cooperation in a predictable and principled way. So they're not just altruistic, they're very functional. And a good regional cooperative arrangement actually minimizes the risk of tensions between states. Those of you who remember the Oceanic Viking experience will understand that that did cause quite a lot of tensions between the states involved, precisely because the rules of interception, rescue at sea, disembarkation and responsibility had not been properly worked out in advance. And we think those are very positive areas that states can and should be interested in. Second area of moving ahead in a positive way is, we believe, a fair and robust asylum system. That is, refugee status for those who need it and protection for those who need it, and the return and, if necessary, removal of people who are found not to be protection. A lot of the policy responses we've seen around the world, and the industrialized world in particular, are to deflect access into the asylum system itself, which we think might be a short-term measure, but it doesn't actually resolve the fundamental issues of asylum. The third is a more genuine and redoubled engagement with like-minded states in the region to develop a collaborative arrangement that is built on mutual respect and tries to solve the problems that many countries in the region are trying to grapple with, particularly around irregular maritime movements by boat. And last, and certainly not least, we have always said that refugees and humanitarian issues do not fare very well if they become embedded in a very vigorous political or media discussion. Refugee issues, humanitarian issues do better when they're below the radar, when they're treated as humanitarian issues rather than politicized issues. And we hope that in future months and years in this country and in the region that we can come back to an educated discussion about the appropriate balance that can easily be found between border security, protecting legitimate concerns of the host state, but also doing the right thing, humanitarian and protection responsibilities towards people who, for no fault of their own, other than coming to a border and asking for help and asylum. Those are people just like us who, for victims of time and circumstance, have found themselves in very difficult and dangerous circumstances. So thank you so much. It's been a great privilege. May I just say this is probably the last occasion I have an opportunity to address members of the United Nations. This is a wonderful organization. The youth and vitality in this room does give us hope that next year, when you start to look at these issues around refugees and protection, both globally and internationally, and nationally as well, that there is a strong spirit of humanitarianism that I've felt in my discussions here today. So thank you very much indeed.